the Allied Vandals did the only thing they could think of to survive. They had joined in the plundering. Stilicho's reinforcements thus wound up reinforcing only the enemy. Whoops. Come the spring of 407, the lines of communication thawed out, and the full extent of the chaos became apparent to the court of Ravenna. But if you thought hordes of barbarians running amok and a Roman general who claimed an imperial title trying to turn them back was chaotic, well, just wait, because the lines between those two are about to become super blurry. See, what we have here is not one monolithic barbarian horde, so much as dozens of smaller groups, all with independent motives swirling around in independent directions. In the middle of the swirl was Constantine and his regular Roman forces. He was aware that he had no hope of restoring order to Gaul solely by way of the sword, so Constantine opened negotiations with the various barbarian kings and chieftains. For their part, these barbarian leaders recognized that they would not have the upper hand forever, and that it might be better to deal with the Romans than fight them. After all, who wanted to be sent back east to face off against the Huns? So when Constantine's envoys came round saying that their general had assumed imperial title and was in a position to make a deal, they listened. Not all of them listened, but enough of them did that pretty soon Constantine's ranks were swelled by the very barbarians he had come down to fight. Having successfully co-opted swaths of the barbarians by the defection of most of the Spanish nobility to his cause. The self-proclaimed Augustus was, after all, the only thing standing between the remaining loose barbarians and Hispania. Down in Ravenna then, Stilicho was left to sort through a very complicated mess. Over here you have barbarian intruders. Okay, they need to be fought off. Over there, you have Constantine fighting them off, but only after illegally donning the purple, and we can't have that. But over here, you have barbarians who have joined with Constantine and his Roman forces. Are they allies because they're fighting the unrepentant barbarian invaders, or are they enemies because they're fighting for an imperial usurper? In what order do you prioritize your response to all this? Stilicho surveyed the mess and ordered his priorities, and in the process sowed as many of the seeds of his own downfall as his enemies would ever need to take him down. Stilicho decided that the first priority would be Constantine. There is absolutely no way you can tolerate self-proclaimed emperors, so all of Stilicho's subsequent preparations were aimed at battle with the usurper, rather than battle with the still loose barbarians. There was a practical element to the decision, as Constantine had moved south and taken control of Lyon. The majority of the loose barbarians were still running amok in northern Gaul, so Stilicho was going to have to go through Constantine to get to them anyway. Might as well settle family business along the way. But the senatorial aristocracy of Italy and southern Gaul was mortified at Stilicho's decision. The empire has been overrun by no-good smelly barbarians, and you're going to use our precious military resources to attack the one guy who's actually been doing something about the invasion? This did not sit well at all. But that would not be the half of it. As Stilicho was remustering his army at the city of Pavia, just on the Italian side of the Alps, he sent word to Alaric that there would be no war with Constantinople that year, and that as such, the Gothic king's services would not be required. But the thing is that just a few months before, Stilicho had ordered Alaric to move south and occupy Epirus, a clear violation of a number of agreements between Ravenna, Constantinople, and the Goths. And it was a move clearly designed to set up Stilicho's crossing of the Adriatic. But now, it was just an extremely provocative maneuver that was just sort of hanging out there. Having footed the bill for, well, let's call it what it was, the invasion of Epirus, Alaric was less than enthused to hear that there would be no further campaign, because that meant there would be no further capture of booty to offset his expenditures. Plus, now he faced potential reprisals from the east for his unprovoked aggression. So Alaric sent a note back to Stilicho, demanding 4,000 pounds of gold to cover Gothic expenses. Now it was Stilicho's turn to be less than enthused, but Alaric had him over a barrel. The Italian army couldn't march on Gaul with hostile Goths threatening their rear, a fact that both sides could plainly see. So Stilicho recommended to the Senate that Alaric be paid. He was able to force the measure through, and the Senate approved the funds, but no one was very happy that a Vandal general was making them hand over gold to a Gothic king so that said Vandal general could go off and fight a Roman army currently engaged in operations against hostile barbarians. With his rear secured, Stilicho was finally able to launch a counterattack. But by then, the campaign season had drawn to a close, so everything was put on hold until early spring 408. As soon as the passes thawed out, though, the Italian army was marching north, led by Sarus, the Goth general who had defected to Rome following the Battle of Verona in 402. Stilicho, his political power eroding, stayed behind in Ravenna to ensure that his enemies did not get a hold of the easily manipulated Emperor Honorius. Sarus met an advance guard of Constantine's army almost the minute he crossed over the Alps, but after a fierce fight, Constantine's men were broken and driven off. Sarus followed this victory by pushing hard to the city of Valentia, where Constantine himself had taken up residence. Sarus besieged the city, but before he could capture the self-proclaimed Augustus and bring a swift end to this rebellion, reinforcements that Constantine had recruited from the Lower Rhine suddenly appeared and drove Sarus off. The timing of this relief army was excellent, but their arrival was more a matter of coincidence than anything else. Assembled to put down a nascent counter-revolution brewing in Spain, the troops just so happened to already be on the way south when Sarus began the siege of Valentia, and so Constantine wound up saved, and Sarus wound up driven off. Now outnumbered locally, Sarus deemed it prudent to withdraw back to Italy and regroup, but as his army approached the Alps, he discovered just how low the prestige of the Italian imperial regime had been laid. An armed and organized band of locals, part freedom fighters and part brigands, had occupied the passes after Sarus passed through the first time, and they were now demanding that the Romans pay a ransom for passage. Although Sarus probably could have forced the issue, the rebels were entrenched, and it would have cost time and resources that the Gothic general didn't have time to spare. So he paid the ransom and carried on. The optics of a Roman imperial army paying a toll to pass through their own backyard was terrible, and lost on exactly no one. In May of 408, Stilicho was preparing the troops for another invasion, this one to coincide with a Theodosian family-led uprising in Spain, that's the nascent counter-revolt I just mentioned, when a bombshell dropped in from the east. The Emperor Arcadius was dead. He was 30 or 31 years old and had been Emperor of the East for 13 years. The last few years' worth of events in Constantinople next week, and for now, I'm just going to focus on the implications of Arcadius' death for the West, specifically the implications for Stilicho. The Vandal general had never gotten over his desire to control both halves of the empire, and Arcadius' death opened up what would probably be his last best chance to unite East and West under his personal control. The logical heir to the throne was Arcadius' 7-year-old son, Theodosius II, but with Honorius now the senior Augustus in the empire, Stilicho argued that the West ought to have some say in how the regime change played out. The last thing Stilicho needed was his enemies in Constantinople, of which there were legion at this point, dominating some new child emperor. Honorius was keen to travel himself to Constantinople and oversee the transition of power, but Stilicho was worried that Honorius too would fall under the sway of the Eastern ministers should he be allowed to leave Italy, and so, citing a number of convenient reasons, that the trip would cost too much, that it would leave Italy open to invasion from Constantine, Stilicho convinced Honorius to stay in Ravenna. Instead, he, Stilicho, would go and represent Honorius' interests. Now, this course of action was not without its own dangers. After all, while Stilicho was gone, his enemies back in Italy, of which there were also legion at this point, could worm their way into Honorius' ear and turn the emperor against him. But the opportunity to put his stamp on the imperial court of Constantinople proved too alluring, and in the summer of 408, Stilicho made preparations to leave. When Honorius and Stilicho parted ways in August, a devious minister and arch-foe of Stilicho's named Olympius swooped in and started spinning a treacherous tale to the emperor. Stilicho, he said, was not going to Constantinople to ensure that Honorius' interests would be protected. He was going to push aside young Theodosius II and install his own son, Eucharius, on the Eastern throne. This was not necessarily an implausible accusation. After all, Eucharius, by way of Stilicho's wife Serena, was the lawful and acknowledged grandson of Theodosius the Great. No one these days believes that this was actually what Stilicho was up to, but at the time, it was an easily believable rumor. Malleable Honorius listened intently to these accusations and decided to buy into them hook, line, and sinker. Before Stilicho was even out of Italy, his enemies in the west had already turned the emperor against him. In August 408, Honorius and his court, sans Stilicho, traveled to Pavia to inspect the troops. Upon their arrival, Olympius set to work spinning more treacherous tales of Stilicho's treachery to the rank-and-file soldiers. Added to the rumor that Stilicho was neglecting his responsibilities because he was busy trying to take over the Eastern Empire, was the more immediately offensive rumor that Stilicho planned to put Alaric in charge of the war against Constantine, which was too much for the Roman troops to bear. When everyone was good and riled up, Olympius gave the signal, and a full-blown mutiny broke out. Honorius fled to the safety of his imperial residence, but most of the high-ranking officers in the army, all allies of Stilicho, were tracked down and killed by the mob. Stilicho was in Bologna when the mutiny broke out, and he immediately recognized what had happened. Olympius had turned the regular Roman forces against him, which meant that Olympius was now almost certainly in control of Honorius. At that moment, Stilicho only had auxiliary forces available to him, a Hunnic bodyguard, and the Goths who had come over after the Battle of Verona. If he contemplated using them to reassert his power, he didn't contemplate it for long. Using barbarians to attack regular Roman forces, who were under Honorius' personal banner no less, wasn't going to win him any friends. When it became clear that Stilicho was hesitating, and that this might be the end for the Vandal general, the Gothic general Sarus withdrew with his forces to see how events played out, a move that likely saved his own life and position in the post-Stilicho purges. Now thoroughly isolated, Stilicho traveled to Ravenna to await the return of the imperial court. If he was able to meet with Honorius, he might be able to talk sense to the boy. But if he could not, and this really was his time, he was apparently determined not to make a messy play for his life. The empire was weak enough. Another